In the summer of 1913, the Arctic Ocean appeared calm. Its surface reflected a pale sky, broken only by drifting ice floes and distant fog banks. To seasoned sailors, it looked no more threatening than it had during countless expeditions before. But beneath that deceptive stillness lay a frozen system governed by forces indifferent to human ambition, planning, or confidence. Into that vast, shifting world sailed a single wooden ship, the Karluk. She was not a warship. She was not a marvel of modern engineering. She was an aging Arctic whaler, repurposed for science, optimism, and a vision that underestimated the Arctic's memory. The Karluk Expedition would soon become one of the most tragic polar ventures of the 20th century, not because of sudden catastrophe, but because of a slow, methodical collapse driven by leadership failures, environmental arrogance, and the relentless mechanics of ice. But at the moment of departure, none of that was visible. The expedition began not with ice, but with ideology. At the center of it all stood Vilhjalmur Stefansson, an Icelandic-Canadian anthropologist and explorer who had built a reputation as one of the Arctic's great optimists. Stefansson believed something radical for his time, that the Arctic was not a frozen wasteland, but a navigable, habitable frontier. He argued that with the right knowledge, indigenous techniques, and confidence, men could live off the land, even in the polar north. Stefansson was persuasive, charismatic, and deeply controversial. He dismissed traditional fears of starvation and isolation, claiming that Arctic hardship was largely a psychological problem. According to him, explorers died not because the Arctic was unforgiving, but because they believed it was. This philosophy would shape every decision that followed. In 1913, with funding from the Canadian government and support from scientific institutions, Stefansson launched the Canadian Arctic Expedition, an ambitious multi-year mission designed to map unknown Arctic islands, conduct geological and biological research, and extend Canada's territorial claims northward. The expedition was divided into two branches. The Southern Party, tasked with scientific research along the mainland, the Northern Party assigned the far more dangerous mission of pushing into uncharted Arctic waters. The Karluk would carry the Northern Party. From the beginning, the Karluk was a compromise. Built in 1884 as a whaling vessel, she was sturdy but outdated. Her reinforced hull had survived earlier Arctic voyages, but by 1913, newer ships with stronger engines and steel reinforcement were available. Several experienced Arctic hands warned that the Karluk was not suitable for extended operations in heavy pack ice. Stefansson dismissed those concerns. He believed skill and adaptability mattered more than hardware. The ship, he insisted, would be sufficient. To command the Karluk, Stefansson appointed Captain Robert Bartlett, one of the most experienced Arctic navigators alive. Bartlett had previously served as captain on Robert Peary's North Pole expedition and had earned the respect of polar veterans worldwide. Bartlett understood ice, and from the moment he inspected the Karluk, he was uneasy. But the expedition had momentum. Funding had been approved. Timelines had been announced. The ship would sail. The Karluk carried 25 men and 1 woman, a mix of sailors, scientists, and specialists, many of whom had never experienced the Arctic before. Among them, Captain Robert Bartlett, pragmatic, disciplined, and deeply aware of the dangers ahead. Vilhjalmur Stefansson, expedition leader and ideological force whose confidence bordered on recklessness. Dr. Alistair Forbes Mackay, physician and Antarctic veteran. Henry Bouchat, French anthropologist. Bob Williamson, photographer. Several young crew members recruited with minimal polar experience. There was also an Inuit family, including Karluk, whose presence reflected Stefansson's belief in indigenous Arctic knowledge, though how that knowledge would be used remained unclear. The expedition's hierarchy was poorly defined. Stefansson held ultimate authority. Bartlett commanded the ship, and when those authorities conflicted, ambiguity ruled. The Karluk departed Esquimalt, British Columbia in June 1913. As she moved north through the Pacific and into the Bering Sea, spirits were high. Equipment was inventoried, scientific instruments were secured, The Arctic's summer sun stretched endlessly across the horizon. To many aboard, the voyage felt like an adventure. Dangerous, yes, but manageable. In July, the ship passed through the Bering Strait, entering the Arctic Ocean. Almost immediately, the ice appeared earlier and thicker than expected. Captain Bartlett grew concerned. Ice conditions in 1913 were unusually severe. Pack ice extended farther south than normal, compressing navigation routes and reducing maneuverability. Bartlett urged caution. Stefansson urged progress. The Karluk pushed on. By early August, the Karluk encountered dense pack ice north of Alaska's coast. Progress slowed to a crawl. The ship's engines strained against floes that closed in relentlessly. Every hour trapped in ice increased risk, not just of immobilization, but of pressure ridges forming beneath the hull. Bartlett recommended retreat. Stefansson disagreed. He believed retreat signaled weakness. More importantly, he believed the ice would loosen. It did not. On August 13, 1913, the inevitable happened. The Karluk became firmly trapped in the pack ice. She could no longer maneuver. She drifted. At first, the situation did not feel catastrophic. Arctic expeditions had wintered in ice before. Ships had survived months of drift and emerged intact in spring. But the Karluk's drift carried her westward, away from known land and toward the heart of the Arctic Ocean. Bartlett tracked their position daily. The numbers were troubling. Each day they moved farther from safety. Supplies were finite, fuel was limited, and the ice showed no signs of releasing its grip. Stefansson remained outwardly calm. He continued planning sledging trips and scientific work, behaving as if immobilization was a temporary inconvenience. Bartlett, however, began preparing for worst-case scenarios. In September 1913, Stefansson made a decision that would define the Karluk expedition forever. He announced plans to leave the ship temporarily with a small party to hunt caribou and seal along the Alaskan coast, claiming it would supplement their food supply. Bartlett objected. The ship was trapped. Ice conditions were worsening. Leaving now meant separation without certainty of return. Stefansson insisted. He assured the crew he would rejoin the Karluk within 10 days. On September 20th, 1913, Stefansson left the ship. He never returned. The Karluk drifted on without the expedition's commander. Responsibility now fell entirely on Captain Bartlett. Winter closed in. Temperatures plummeted. Darkness returned. The pack ice tightened around the hull like a vice. By October, pressure ridges began forming beneath the ship. The wood groaned. Timbers flexed. Bartlett ordered emergency preparations. Supplies moved onto the ice. Sledges packed. Tents assembled. Everyone aboard understood what this meant. The Karluk was dying. On January 10, 1914, the ice crushed inward with terrifying force. The hull fractured. Water flooded the hold. The Karluk was being slowly, inexorably destroyed by the Arctic itself. There was no dramatic explosion, no single fatal blow, just pressure, cold, and time. The crew evacuated onto the ice as the ship that had carried their hopes north sank beneath the frozen surface. The Karluk disappeared into the Arctic Ocean, leaving her people stranded on moving ice hundreds of miles from land, and winter was only beginning. When the Karluk finally vanished beneath the ice on January 11, 1914, the Arctic did not react. There was no sound beyond the low groan of shifting floes, no dramatic collapse, no sense of closure. The ship simply slipped away, swallowed by black water and frozen pressure, leaving 22 people standing on a
drifting sheet of ice in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. In that moment, the expedition ceased to be a scientific mission. It became a survival problem. And survival in the Arctic is never democratic. It is brutal, selective, and unforgiving of hesitation. Captain Robert Bartlett understood the reality immediately. They were not on land, they were not stationary. They were standing on a fragment of a constantly moving system, drifting westward toward Siberia. Beneath their boots, the ice cracked and groaned, a reminder that even their temporary refuge was unstable.
Bartlett organized the camp with military precision. Tents were erected, supplies salvaged from the ship were inventoried. Sledges were assembled using planks torn from the Karluk's wreckage. Rations were calculated with grim accuracy. Even with strict discipline, food would not last indefinitely. The only viable option was escape. Bartlett set his objective clearly: Wrangel Island, a remote Arctic landmass over 80 miles away. It was their best, and perhaps only, chance. But reaching it meant crossing moving, fractured sea ice, riddled with pressure ridges, open leads of freezing water, and unpredictable storms. And winter was tightening its grip. Days passed, then weeks. The ice carried them farther west, sometimes undoing progress they had made toward Wrangel Island. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Wind scoured exposed skin raw in minutes. The men slept in damp clothing. Frostbite became constant. Some members trusted Bartlett implicitly. Others resented the discipline he imposed. A few clung to the belief that Stefansson would somehow reappear, an illusion that Bartlett did not encourage. Every day, the group grew weaker. In late January, Bartlett ordered the first reconnaissance trips toward Wrangel Island. The ice was worse than expected. Jagged ridges rose like frozen waves. Open leads forced detours that cost precious energy. Sledges broke, dogs collapsed from exhaustion. Progress measured in hundreds of meters per day. Still, Bartlett pushed forward cautiously, knowing that waiting meant death. The group split into smaller parties to scout routes and conserve resources. That decision, necessary as it was, would accelerate the collapse. As conditions worsened, leadership fractures emerged. Some men questioned Bartlett's authority. Others openly blamed Stefansson, though he was long gone. A few began prioritizing personal survival over group cohesion. The Arctic amplifies human nature. Fear becomes selfishness. Exhaustion erodes loyalty. Cold strips away pretense. One man, Alistair McKay, a seasoned polar veteran, struggled physically and mentally. Others, less experienced, fared even worse. Bartlett watched as small failures accumulated. Missed watches, poor ration discipline, careless frostbite injuries. The group was unraveling. In February 1914, Bartlett made the hardest decision of his life. He would lead a small party to Wrangel Island himself, not to abandon the others, but to secure help. Someone had to survive long enough to bring rescue. He selected Karluk, an Inuit hunter whose Arctic skill far surpassed that of the Europeans. The plan was desperate, but logical. Bartlett left the remaining survivors under instructions to follow as best they could. He promised he would return. As he and Karluk disappeared into the frozen horizon, those left behind watched in silence. They would never see him again. Without Bartlett, the remaining group struggled immediately. Leadership fell to John Munro, whose authority was weaker and less respected. Decision-making slowed, arguments multiplied. Food dwindled faster than planned. Some attempted independent marches toward Wrangel Island, breaking away from the main group. That decision proved fatal. One by one, men fell. Some collapsed from exhaustion and hypothermia. Others vanished during storms. A few succumbed quietly in their sleeping bags, never waking. The ice claimed them without ceremony. Bodies were buried beneath snow or left behind, markers of failure etched into the white void. Among the dead were James Murray, the biologist Henry Bouchat, the anthropologist, several crew members whose names would later be recorded only in recovery reports. Each death reduced morale further. Each death made survival harder for those who remained. By March, the survivors who reached Wrangel Island were barely recognizable. Emaciated, frostbitten, mentally fractured. Wrangel Island offered no comfort, only rock, wind, and limited game. Seal hunts failed, ammunition dwindled, starvation loomed. Some men lost hope entirely. One survivor later recalled that silence had become oppressive, broken only by wind and the sound of their own breathing. They were alive, but barely. Meanwhile, Captain Bartlett and Karluk pressed southward. They crossed over 700 miles of Arctic ice and tundra, one of the most extraordinary survival journeys ever recorded. Bartlett suffered frostbite and snow blindness. Karluk saved his life repeatedly through indigenous knowledge of hunting, navigation, and shelter. After months of travel, Bartlett reached Siberia. From there, he contacted authorities. Rescue was finally organized. In September 1914, 8 months after the Karluk sank, a rescue ship reached Wrangel Island. Of the original party stranded on the ice, only 8 were still alive. 14 had died. Their bodies were never all recovered. The Arctic had claimed them quietly. News of the Karluk disaster shocked the scientific world. Questions were asked. Why had an unsuitable ship been chosen? Why had Stefansson left the ship? Why had warnings been ignored? Stefansson survived, and controversially continued his career. Bartlett was hailed as a hero, but the truth was more complex. The Karluk Expedition failed not because of one mistake, but because of a chain of decisions rooted in overconfidence. The Arctic did not punish recklessness, it simply removed protection. The Karluk disaster reshaped Arctic exploration. It reinforced lessons written in ice and blood. Preparation matters. Leadership matters. Indigenous knowledge is not optional, and optimism is not a survival strategy. Most importantly, it proved that belief cannot bend physics. When the survivors of the Karluk expedition finally returned to civilization, they carried more than frostbitten limbs and hollowed faces. They carried questions. Questions that could not be buried under snow. Questions that would follow the expedition for decades. Questions that cut far deeper than the ice that crushed the ship. How had a government-backed scientific expedition ended with so many dead? And who, if anyone, was responsible? In late 1914, as testimonies reached Canada and the United States, newspapers began piecing together the story. The narrative that emerged was deeply unsettling. The Karluk had not been lost to a sudden, unpredictable catastrophe. It had been slowly pushed toward disaster, step by decisions made long before the ship ever touched Arctic ice. Investigations focus on three central issues: the suitability of the Karluk itself, the leadership structure of the expedition, and Vilhjalmur Stefansson's decision to abandon the ship. Each point sparked controversy. Maritime experts quickly agreed on one fact: the Karluk was not fit for the mission she had been assigned. Though reinforced for whaling, she lacked the structural strength and engine power required for prolonged entrapment in heavy pack ice. More modern vessels were available at the time, ships with stronger hulls and better propulsion systems. Why then was the Karluk chosen? The answer appeared to be a mixture of cost, convenience, and confidence. Stefansson believed experience and adaptability outweighed engineering limitations. Critics argued this belief bordered on arrogance. Captain Robert Bartlett raised concerns before departure. His warnings were ignored. In hindsight, the Karluk's destruction was not surprising, it was inevitable. The most contentious issue, however, was leadership. The Canadian Arctic expedition lacked a clear chain of command. Stefansson held overall authority, while Bartlett commanded the ship, a division that worked only as long as their judgments aligned. When they did not, no mechanism existed to resolve conflict. This ambiguity became fatal when Stefansson chose to leave the Karluk in September 1913. Officially, he described the decision as a short hunting excursion, meant to secure food. Unofficially, many believed it was an act of abandonment. Stefansson insisted he intended to return, but intent mattered little. He never did. Stefansson survived the Arctic and returned to public life largely unscathed. He published books, delivered lectures, and continued promoting his vision of the Arctic as a habitable frontier. In his accounts, the Karluk disaster was framed as unfortunate but unavoidable, a consequence of ice conditions rather than leadership failure. He praised Bartlett publicly. Privately, survivors were less forgiving. Several accused Stefansson of minimizing risk, dismissing warnings, and placing ideology above human life. Yet, no formal charges were ever brought. History would judge him, but quietly. If Stefansson became the expedition's most controversial figure, Captain Robert Bartlett became the expedition's moral anchor. Bartlett was widely praised for his discipline, leadership, and extraordinary journey to secure rescue. His decision to leave the stranded group was painful, but ultimately life-saving. Without Bartlett's march to Siberia, no one would have survived. Yet even Bartlett carried guilt. In later years, he admitted the expedition should never have pushed so far into the ice. Experience had told him so. Authority had overruled him. His testimony shaped future Arctic policy more than any official report. The Karluk expedition had been conceived as a triumph of science. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. Many of the expedition's scientific goals were lost with the ship. Instruments destroyed, data scattered across the ice, research left incomplete. But the human cost overshadowed everything else. 14 lives were lost after the Karluk sank. Men who had trusted preparation, leadership, and promises. The Arctic exposed the difference between optimism and reality. In the years that followed, Arctic exploration changed. Governments imposed stricter ship requirements. Clearer command structures became mandatory. Indigenous expertise began to be treated as essential, not optional. The Karluk disaster joined a growing list of polar tragedies that proved one truth beyond debate. Nature does not reward belief, it responds only to preparation. The Karluk herself remains lost beneath Arctic waters. Her exact resting place is unknown, sealed beneath ice, sediment, and time. No memorial marks her grave, but her story survives in journals, testimonies, and the frozen silence of Wrangel Island, where bones once lay half buried in snow. The Karluk expedition did not fail because the Arctic was cruel. It failed because human certainty met an environment that does not compromise. The men who boarded the Karluk believed they were part of progress, of science pushing boundaries. Instead, they became evidence of a boundary that cannot be crossed lightly. The Arctic did not rage, it did not attack, it simply applied pressure. And when the ship broke, so did the illusion that confidence alone could conquer the unknown. The Karluk is gone, the ice has moved on, but the lesson remains. Written not in ink, but in ice, distance, and loss. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking it. This helps prevent these forgotten expeditions from being lost again. And if you want to continue exploring real journeys that ended in tragedy, subscribe to the channel.